Welcome, incoming Spartans. My name is Dr. Jennifer Cobbina. I'm an associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. Much of my research centers on race, crime, policing, and protesters' response to police violence. I recently published a book called Hands Up, Don't Shoot: Why the Protests in Ferguson and Baltimore Matter and How They Changed America. With everything going on in the world with regards to civil unrest, I am going to talk about George Floyd's murder, protests, how that coincides with protests that occurred in Ferguson and Baltimore. I also want to talk about the history of race and policing, and also divesting in the police and what it means to really defund when cries are made to defund the police. Acts of injustice against Black people, including George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and Christian Cooper, and countless others. These are all recent examples of the state violence that many Black people have encountered in the United States. We all know that George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American man, was murdered because a Minneapolis police officer pressed his knee into his back for nearly 9 minutes, while 3 other officers did nothing to stop it, as George Floyd begged for his life and pleaded for his mother. Amid COVID-19, George Floyd's killing has sparked sustained protests across the country and also around the world, as millions have taken to the streets to protest systemic racism, police violence, and broader structural inequalities. We have seen cities set on fire with the anguish, the pain, and the deep sorrow that's wrought about by the violence visited on the bodies of Black people. But at the same time, violence, protests, and demonstrations are not new. In many ways, the massive demonstrations that are taking place resemble the protests that took place in Ferguson, Missouri, and in Baltimore, Maryland, following both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray's deaths in 2014 and 2015. The death of both young Black men gave rise to the Black Lives Matter movement, which emerged in 2013 after the murder acquittal of George Zimmerman in the death of Trayvon Martin, who at the time was a 17-year-old African-American boy. Because many African Americans were tired of the killings of Blacks by police and self-declared vigilantes, this movement really unfolded as a call for action, demanding changes with how police deal with racial ethnic minorities, and also calling for an end to systemic racism that exists in this country. The deaths of both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray were 2 of several high-profile killings that gave impetus to the Black Lives Matter movement. Protests at each of these locations also brought up decades of pent-up emotions of anger, frustration, and outrage from much of the Black community. The use of aggressive police tactics that were used against protesters at each of these locations also confirmed to many the continued racism and discrimination that Blacks experience and still suffer at the hands of various state institutions, including law enforcement. The city of Ferguson was a flashpoint for nationwide protests since the killings of Michael Brown, who at the time was unarmed, and he was fatally killed by a white police officer from the Ferguson Police Department. 2 to 3 months following both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray's deaths, I conducted nearly 200 interviews with protesters and residents of both of these cities. And large amounts of people took to the streets because they believed that both Michael Brown and Freddie Gray were victims of injustice and that these were not isolated incidents. In addition, many felt an overwhelming obligation to demonstrate because they understood that failure to do so would result in more Black people dying at the hands of the police. And so as a result, approximately 2/3 of people in my study who protested back then were doing so for the first time. Among the activists that I interviewed, the desire to achieve change and put an end to police violence and systemic racism, these were central factors to protest participation. However, it was not uncommon for protesters on the front lines to also experience aggressive military tactics that were used by the police. Though there were thousands of people who took to the streets to protest treatment by the state, the government sent more police with high-powered weapons and military tanks. And similar to what we've seen over the last few weeks in some cities, the tactics that law enforcement were using to manage protesters were also deployed on demonstrators, such as the use of tear gas, rubber bullets, physical force, and large-scale arrests. Those who protested on the front lines and who were more vocal about denouncing police violence and who actually challenged law enforcement, they are more likely to experience and also witness aggressive police action. Yet despite having experienced violence from the state, those who remained the most committed to the movement, they were insistent on remaining active in future street protests in order to bring about change. However, there were others who were discouraged from engaging in future street protests because of the aggressive ways that authorities were policing the protests. And yet, even amid all that, many adapted different ways to try to stay motivated and engaged and still engage in the overall ideological goal of the Black Lives Matter movement. For instance, there were some who organized and strategized behind the scenes. Others became grassroots organizers. There were some who became much more civically engaged, and others became social justice advocates. And so ultimately, the more aggressive the police were, the more some protesters developed resistance and became much more civically engaged in an effort to root out systemic racism and put an end to police violence that continued to rob many Black people of their lives. And so ending the killing of Black people by the police will not take place by continuously investing and expanding in law enforcement. We know that this nation was founded on a system of slavery, but what many people are not always aware of is that the origins of policing can be directly tied to the institution of slavery. Slave patrols were among the first state-sponsored police force that controlled the slave population. And to defend their slave property interests, slave codes were established. Slave codes are essentially were state laws that essentially define the status of slaves and the rights of their owners, giving the owners absolute power to govern their slaves as chattel or as property. Even when slavery was abolished, states relied heavily on the legal system and the prison system in order to create policies to maintain racial subordination. For instance, Black codes were established, which essentially created new offenses for certain types of behaviors, such as vagrancy and loitering. Anyone who is found in violation of these laws essentially would be punishable by fine, by imprisonment, and forced labor for up to 1 year. These laws were discriminatory in nature because they were applied selectively to Blacks in an attempt to restrict their movements and force them to work based upon cheap labor. Even when Black codes were overturned, Southern states pursued racial segregation in an attempt to ensure white supremacy. And this led to the proliferation of Jim Crow, which essentially referred to the various state laws that established different rules for Blacks and whites. And so we continue to see such acts of racial subordination taking place through mass incarceration, where a disproportionate number of people who are incarcerated are Black and brown individuals. And so from slave patrols to slave codes to Black codes to Jim Crow laws, and now with mass incarceration, racially biased legislation has been enforced for several centuries. And this is important to bring up only because the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow continues to shape Black people's experiences and positions in society, and also influences how they're often treated by individuals and institutions, including the criminal legal system. America's long history of state-sanctioned violence against Black Americans really reflect persistent inequities within the criminal legal system. And so the movement for Black Lives and many other activists have been calling for reinvestments of federal dollars to education, employment, and social services in Black communities, which have been shown to improve community safety. So the whole idea behind defunding the police is really that there should be massive restructuring of public spending priorities. Currently, the way our government deals with many poor inner city neighborhoods is by overinvesting in policing and criminal justice, and at the same time underinvesting in social programs or economic opportunities. So for instance, in the United States, we rely heavily on the police to solve a host of societal problems, from issues of abuse, abandonment, homelessness, domestic disputes, school disruptions, and unemployment. We rely on the state to deal with all of these societal problems instead of looking to social workers, therapists, educators, and medical workers, all of whom are experts within their field. And so calls to defund the police entails reducing the amount of money that goes into law enforcement and prison expansion, yet at the same time investing instead in resources that create safety, safety for Black people and people of color. And so that means investing in high quality public schools, investing in clean and affordable housing, mental health care. It also means investing in the creation of living wage jobs that offer healthcare and benefits. And it also means investing in social programs and youth development services. So rather than continuing to create or feed a culture of control, we must advocate for creating a culture of care where we invest in systems that really have been shown to stabilize communities. And investing in social policies would help to prevent people from experiencing harm and violence in the first place. And it would also allow individuals who live within these marginalized communities not just the opportunity to survive, but to thrive. So I hope you will consider these issues as you make the move to MSU. Thank you.